evening. You're watching Primetime. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Global sell-off spills over onto Dalal Street. Sensex loses 560 points. Nifty drops 1.5% as all 50 stocks end in the red. Sea of red across Europe as the benchmark indices suffer deep cuts. Dow futures pair early losses but still point to a negative opening. Bitcoin continues its downward spiral, briefly breaks below the $6,000 mark before bouncing back above $7,000. Forex volatility hurts Lupin in the third quarter. The drug maker sees its profit fall 65%. Hero MotoCorp meets estimates even as higher commodity prices hurt margins. And Congress President Rahul Gandhi calls the Rafale deal a scam after Defence Minister Nirmala Sitharaman says details of the deal cannot be disclosed. Now, the global market rout spilled over to India as markets fell for a sixth day in a row. Both the Nifty and Sensex lost over 1.5% in trade. Losses in today's session wiped out over 2 lakh crore rupees in market value for the benchmark. Neeraj Shah sums up all the action on Dalal Street today.
We're ending off the lows of the day, which is probably the one key way to look at it. The Nifty down about 1.5%, Sensex down about 1.6%. The mid caps and the small caps too showing some cuts, but the Nifty Bank was off the lows of the day. I think from the lows of the day, the Nifty Bank rallied almost 900 odd points, and which is, I think, quite a telling statistic. Ending down just about 1% and a quarter. Actually, not too bad. What dominated trade? Let's first get in the stocks which bucked the trend were off the day's lows. Bajaj Finance, the principal one, really went up as much as high as 5% intraday, but ending up at 3.5%. ICICI Bank, which was up about 1.5% to a couple of percentage points, ending marginally in the green, but still bucking the trend. What actually went down? Tata Motors, and you could argue that even results played a part here, down 5%, and then IT had a really bad day in trade. So HCL Tech, Tech Mahindra, TCS, Infosys, all of these had deep gashes, anywhere between 2.5 to 4% in trade for each of these. That aside, moving on to the broader end of the spectrum, Vakrangi and PC Jewelers continued to grind lower, so not a good day for either of these. There were some other stocks which stole the limelight. Very high quality names, Siad, Dilip, Buildcon have been the favorites of investors, but seeing some deep gashes in today's trade as well. And while there were a set of losers like these, one or two stocks which bucked the trend included Bhushan Steel, which was up about 14.5%, and a few sporadic moves really for stocks, which did reasonably okay at the broader end of the spectrum, but those were few and far in between, to be honest. The likes of TVS, Sri Chakra, that they belong to the losers, and the market bit showed it all. So yes, deep cuts. Let's wait and watch if tomorrow is another day.
Well, Asian markets closed sharply lower as the week close in Dalal in Wall Street spilled over. Nikkei, Shanghai and Hang Seng indices closed with significant losses. European markets also tumbled in trade today. FTSE, CAC and DAX all posted sharp cuts as well. Let's take a look at the US markets, which have just opened, and the weakness can be seen over there. US markets also opening in negative zone. Now, Romain Bostic of Bloomberg News joins us for more on the US markets. Romain, how are people preparing for the day today?
Well, I mean, we came into this day expecting to hit correction territory, and if you look at what's happening on your screens right now, I mean, we've pretty much gotten there. I mean, we're down about 10% from our highs on both the S&P and the Dow Jones Industrials, and we're about to get there on the NASDAQ. We're seeing a little bit of a rebound from some of the lows that we had coming out of the gate today. We were down about 2% at the open. We're only down about 1% on the major indexes right now. But this is what everyone was expecting. I mean, we've been in overbought territory for a long time. We've been underweight risk for a long time. And what you're seeing play out today and what you're seeing play out yesterday is really just a rebalancing of all those risks.
All right, thank you so much, Romain. They're talking about US markets, of course, have opened week about 5% down. Let's go across to our speakers on the show this evening. I'm joined by Sandeep Jain, Director of Trade Swift Broking, who joins us from Jaipur, as well as Michael Ingram, Chief Market Strategist, Wireland Wealth Management and Corporate and Institutional Broking, also joins us from London. Welcome to both of you. I'm going to go to Michael first. Expecting another rough day in the US markets?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're not quite sure how much unwind of, for instance, short volatility positions is still to come. I think, you know, particularly after the move that we saw overnight, we've probably seen most of it. Yeah, but you can never quite be sure. I think it could have been worse. I mean, if you look at the latest data in terms of so-called hot money accounts, certainly from the CBOE, I mean, it suggests that having been at record shorts on volatility, they closed something like 60 to 70% of those positions out by the end of January. So at least not carrying that through. I think ultimately this turns on whether or not you know, the shakeout that we've seen, principally emanating from the bond market, is going to continue. It's quite interesting to see bonds rally in Europe today, treading water in the US. Part of it, I think, is to do with, you know, where is the Fed going? We could have a completely different Fed in 2018. Where is the broader thrust of US policy going? Obviously, we had, you know, part of what we're having to deal with now emanated from, you know, statements coming out of Davos from Steve Mnuchin, you know, appearing to countenance a weaker dollar. So there are a lot of question marks out there. At the moment, I get the feeling that we're probably close to the end of this particular correction. But, you know, valuations are heightened, particularly in the US. We've been cautious on the US for some time. There's a certain amount of pricing for perfection already in market multiples, even after this correction. And again, you know, I think part of the impetus for this recent downward move has been some of these very, you know, disappointing numbers that we've seen from some index heavyweights such as Apple, Microsoft, and Google.
Well, that pain continues. In open, both the Dow Jones and S&P 500 nearly 4.5% down at this point. Michael, do you see that spillover into global markets? Of course, here in India, we're looking at tomorrow and how that is going to pan out. Any comments there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there has clearly been some spillover. I mean, we like to feel that we are now in a multipolar world, but it's still the case that if there's a problem in the US or there's an issue in the US, there's going to be a read across to other markets. I mean, I'm actually quite heartened to see that we're seeing emerging markets as a whole outperform during this recent downturn. So it's not a classic risk-off scenario that we're seeing at the moment. And, you know, I don't think there's anything in the movement in asset prices or, you know, credit, for instance, to suggest that the story for 2008 of accelerating and relatively synchronized economic growth is going to be derailed. Of course, 2019 is another story.
Of course, Sandeep, here we're looking at other big factors tomorrow as well, and I'll come to that in just a bit. But just looking at US Open right now, and a lot of Indian investors right now are looking at the US Open and wondering what's going to happen tomorrow. How are you seeing this impacting?
Yeah, very certainly. In fact, everyone has their eyes on, in fact, Dow Jones only, and there was a very smart recovery during the Indian markets. So I think, you know, today's closing will be very important for the Dow Jones also, because somehow Nifty is moving in tandem with, you know, Dow Jones, and somewhere around 24 to 25 to 200 to 250 levels should be a very strong support, and that's the 100 DMA also. Technically, if you say that's the 100 days exponential moving average. So, you know, lots of times markets generally tend to, you know, take some support at these important averages. So today, the Indian markets also took important support at around 10,400 levels, and from there it bounced back very sharply to around 500 plus levels and managed to close down at around 498, 10,498. So, you know, things are not that very good, and, you know, the global rout, if we can see, the CBOE VIX also has gone up so steeply up, and if you see the credit policy also tomorrow in India, we have a very big event. You know, if the tone is hawkish.
I'm coming to that. I'm coming to the credit policy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. But before we come to that, Sandeep, you agree, or do you think that this is all global? What we've seen in Indian markets today and possibly tomorrow, how much of it is just the impact of global markets?
Certainly, it's much of the global impact, and somehow the budget was also not being appreciated by the market men and the long-term capital gains tax. and the Rajasthan state election, by-election results also, and at the same time, the populist nature of the budget also has not been taken that easily by the markets. And above all, Dow Jones was certainly being, the correction was long due there, and after the correction it came so sharply, so it was actually beyond the expectations of the market men. So let's see what happens, but the correction is, I think we have to see some more correction, and if we can see somewhere around say 23,000, that can be a very good support for the Dow Jones, and for Indian context, I think it can be 10,000 where we can see good support.
All right, of course, the big event tomorrow is the monetary policy. The RBI's Monetary Policy Committee will announce its decision tomorrow. Bond yields seem to be already pricing in a hawkish RBI. What will be the key factors at play at the MPC meet? Well, Ira Dugal has this report.
The Monetary Policy Committee meets for the last time this fiscal year and delivers its decision on Wednesday. The expectation across the board consensus view is that there will be no cut in interest rates. Why? Well, let's explain and look at the various aspects that will go into this time's decision. The first thing to take note of is what has happened to inflation over the last few months. Now, until about 3 months back, there was still some expectation that maybe there'll be one odd rate cut more from the MPC. But that expectation has dwindled, in fact, completely died down, because inflation has gone above the midpoint of 4%. In fact, in the last reading, inflation was above 5%. And over the June to December period, you've seen inflation normalize quite rapidly. But remember, the inflation targeting framework is a forward-looking framework, so the MPC will be more worried about what inflation looks like from here on. And there, if you lean upon the professional forecasters survey that the RBI puts out quarterly, even from that, you get a sense that from here on, over the next 2 quarters, that is the current quarter and the 2 quarters after that, you will see inflation remain above the midpoint of 4%. And this is before we take into account the fact that global commodity prices have continued to rise between last policy and this policy, and oil in particular has continued to rise as well. That's the inflation story. There are various other elements that have gotten built into this since the budget, and particularly the fiscal deficit trend. Now, remember, the government did not manage to meet its fiscal goal for FY18. You could forgive them that because of GST, but they're not intending to meet a 3% fiscal deficit target even in FY19 or FY20. They have now pushed back the 3% fiscal deficit target to FY21. Does that have a bearing on the MPC's ability to meet its 4% inflation target on a durable fashion? I think we'd like to hear particularly from Governor Urjit Patel on that, because in his inflation targeting report, or rather the Monetary Policy Framework report of 2014, he had said that he would like to see the fiscal deficit brought down to 3%, which he thought was necessary and achievable. So we'll watch for the MPC's view on fiscal deficit and fiscal consolidation. We'll also watch for the MPC's view on the MSP story, the minimum support prices. Now, in the budget, the government had said that for the Kharif crop, they will ensure 1.5 times production remuneration to farmers. Will that spark more inflation? Well, there are divided views on that. For instance, Bank of America Merrill Lynch does not believe this is going to be particularly inflationary. Nomura said that for every 1% increase in MSP, you could see 10 to 15 basis points added to the headline inflation number. And Sajid Chinoy of JP Morgan said that you have to watch how rapidly they do this, and in particular you have to watch paddy to see what the headline impact is going to be of that MSP announcement. So that is another uncertainty that the MPC will have to weigh. The final thing that the MPC will have to weigh is what has happened to market interest rates, at least the bond market interest rates. Now, yields have climbed up for a bunch of reasons: expectation of higher inflation, expectation of tighter monetary policy, and most importantly, expectation of fiscal slippage, which means that the gap between the repo rate and the 10-year rate is now 150 basis points. Will the MPC take note of that and the impact that could have on just a nascent recovery in the economic cycle? We'll watch for that. But remember, the last policy time when Urjit Patel was asked whether liquidity conditions were too tight and bond deals were cited as a reason for that question, Urjit Patel said that he is watching the call money market, which is the overnight bank lending rate, and that has been near the repo rate at 6%. So if he continues with that view, perhaps while the RBI will tackle the issue of higher market rates, they may not be in a mood to do anything about it, and do anything means commit perhaps to open market operations or easier liquidity conditions. So they will take note of that as well. One final thing, in the last few days, we've started to see global volatility as well pick up, and that certainly will be at the back of the mind of the MPC as they make this final decision of the current fiscal year.
Right, Sandeep Jain and Michael Ingram are still with us, and we're talking markets. But now, Sandeep, specifically, let's come to the point on credit policy. What are you going to be watching out for, and how could what key factors and key numbers will the markets look at?
Yeah, certainly, market is expecting no rate change. In fact, that's for sure. But somehow, hawkish tone is what market is looking for, and I think market is expecting an hawkish tone also in the budget and in the credit policy, because the last credit policy and this credit policy, there has been a very big change in crude oil prices. They have spiked to $70. So I think as finance ministry has also pointed out to their concern over the crude oil prices. So I think they will have a tough time. The MPC will have a tough time. And inflation is also will be a big challenge. So let's see what happens. But somehow it's very important how the tone will be, and that will set the tone of the market tomorrow.
Right. Last comment from you, Michael. Specifically, what are you looking at from India in this global scenario, which looks a little scary right now? How do you look at India among the emerging markets?
Well, I think India has tended to be a favourite because it's a relatively high level of transparency, and obviously the Modi government has helped that narrative in recent years. The issue on the flip side is that India has tended to trade at a significant premium to their emerging market counterparts, and many investors have a problem with the valuation. And I suppose the fear, although as I said, there isn't any signs that this is a true risk off episode at the moment. As I said, emerging markets seem to have actually outperformed during this recent global sell-off. But there's an issue that if we are going to see significantly higher real rates emanating perhaps from the US, then that might actually put the squeeze on some of those very high multiples that we're seeing across in the Indian market. So we might be in a position where emerging markets continue to outperform global, but India underperforms within emerging markets.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Ingram and Sandeep Jain, for speaking with us. And now let's talk a bit about cryptocurrencies. The rout in cryptocurrencies intensified today as Bitcoin sank to its lowest level since October. Regulatory fears have led to the ongoing fall. At one point, Bitcoin dropped below $6,000 as it tumbled by nearly 16%. At the moment, it's hovering around above $7,000 at this point. And Lupin's third quarter profits declined as the drug maker incurred a foreign exchange loss. Net profit fell 65% to 222 crore rupees, well below the analysts' estimates. Revenues came in line with estimates but fell 11.3% in the quarter. Operational performance was also below consensus as EBITDA fell by 39%, while margins contracted to 17.31%. Managing Director of Lupin, Nilesh Gupta, said that Q3 earnings were muted on the back of business mix and forex losses.
Very strong pipeline of products, a good number of approvals as well. And I think all of this is going to help us build the US business to get it back on the growth path. We had a warning letter on 2 of our sites, on Goa and on Indore Unit 2. We are obviously deeply disappointed with the fact that this happened. We've had a very strong compliance record with the FDA. But we're really using this as an opportunity to get to best in class.
And strong quarterly sales and volume growth aided Hero MotoCorp as it met estimates in Q3. Net profit rose 4.3%, while revenues rose 15%. EBITDA rose 7.2%, while operating margins fell marginally to 15.9%. Yatin Mota sums up the key takeaways.
Hero MotoCorp's third quarter earnings were largely in line with the street expectations. Now, if you look at the key 5 factors, as I was mentioning, the results are in line with expectations. Margins also come in at 15.9%, more or less in line with the street expectations. So on the operating side, it was a decent show. Of course, this time we had a 16% volume growth, which contributed to bulk of the revenue growth that we saw. Of course, this time a few reasons because of which the margins were lower on a year-on-year basis, which is on plate number 3, that we have the year-end discounts and promotions which impacted the overall realizations, and that is the reason why margins were under slight bit of pressure. Not only that, we had the other expenses component also, and the commodity cost. Steel and aluminum prices have moved up significantly, which form part of their costs. And that is the reason why, again, on the back of higher commodity costs, the margins were under pressure. And finally, we have the commodity impact because of which the management mentioned that there was margin pressure. But despite all those factors, Hero MotoCorp managed to meet the third quarter analyst expectations.
And Congress President Rahul Gandhi called the Rafale deal with France a scam. This comes after Defence Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said in Parliament that details on the deal could not be disclosed as it was classified information. Gandhi had alleged during the Gujarat elections that Prime Minister Modi personally went to Paris to change the deal to favour a businessman.
घपला हुआ है और मोदी कैसा घपला हुआ है? मोदी जी ने पर्सनली ये डील कराई है। मोदी जी पर्सनली पेरिस गए हैं, पर्सनली वहां पे डील चेंज की गई है, पूरा हिंदुस्तान जानता है। और रक्षा मंत्री जी कहती हैं कि हम हिंदुस्तान को और जो हिंदुस्तान के शहीद हैं उनको और उनके परिवारों को राफेल डील में कितना पैसा, क्या रेट लिया गया है उसके बारे में नहीं बताएंगे। क्या मतलब है इसका? एक ही मतलब है, नहीं एक ही मतलब है ना, एक ही मतलब है कि कोई ना कोई घपला हुआ है। आपने कभी ऐसी पहले कभी सुना है कि सरकार हिंदुस्तान को यह नहीं बताएगी कि किस प्राइस पे हमने हवाई जहाज खरीदा है? यह आपने कभी सुना है? सीक्रेट पैक्ट है फ्रांस की सरकार के साथ। रक्षा मंत्री जी कहते हैं कि हम बता नहीं सकते हिंदुस्तान को।
Meanwhile, opposition parties boycotted the Rajya Sabha after heated exchanges between members of opposition parties and the chair in Rajya Sabha. Initially, the upper house was adjourned till 2 p.m. after Trinamool Congress gave an adjournment motion notice over the governor's interference in state work. Upon resumption, the ruckus continued as opposition parties alleged that their voices were being muzzled in parliament. Leader of opposition Ghulam Nabi Azad has alleged that Rajya Sabha chairman Venkaiah Naidu did not allow them to raise issues in the parliament. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley has called the protests in Parliament by opposition parties as unprecedented.
What the opposition parties have done in the Rajya Sabha today, led by the Congress party, is absolutely unprecedented. So there is a huge opportunity in a systematic manner of discussing all political issues, all economic issues this week in Parliament. Now, instead of doing that, if repeatedly rules are to be violated and every day an effort has to be made to get the House adjourned by disturbance, then it's obvious that they don't want an organized systematic discussion in the House.
And Lok Sabha was also adjourned briefly amidst protests by members of NDA ally Telugu Desam Party. TDP, who is BJP's biggest alliance partner in South India, has demanded special facilities for Andhra Pradesh. Members of YSR Congress also joined the protests. Both parties have said that they are disappointed with the union budget as it did not address the needs of the people of Andhra Pradesh.
We have been denied all the promises and assurances given by the government, the previous government and this government, the special package, funding for Polavaram, funding for Amravati, the deficit budget, all the things in the AP Reorganization Act and assurances given by the then Prime Minister on the floor of the House should be met. This is the fifth budget after this government has taken over. It's the last final budget. If it's not done now, we want all these things done in this term.
Realistic way, what they have committed, they should have been included in at least this budget. This budget, they have included Maharashtra and where they are ruling Rajasthan or Gujarat and bullet trail they are talking and Karnataka they have included where they are thinking that they may come back to the power in Karnataka. So this is actually ditch to the friendly party.
I want to request my friends, madam, through you, that the Honorable Prime Minister and Government of India is very sensitive about the development of Andhra Pradesh. Therefore, the matters they are raising will be looked into.
And we'll talk a bit more about that story because it's not just about the TDP protesting. Remember, the Shiv Sena is already upset with the BJP. Is there trouble within the National Democratic Alliance led by the BJP? How much of a difference will it make to them going into 2019? We're going to have that conversation on Primetime Debate this evening. Do stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, the big international story. Former President of Maldives, Mohammad Nasheed, has asked India for military assistance to resolve the ongoing political crisis. Nasheed has sought India's help to free the judges and political detainees, including former President Abdul Gayoom. Nasheed has also requested Indian and US governments to help remove President Abdullah Yameen from power. Yesterday, President Abdullah Yameen declared an emergency in the country after a standoff with the Supreme Court. Yameen has also arrested two of the country's top judges and many members of the opposition. The Indian government has already asked all Indian nationals not to undertake non-essential travel to the island nation until further notice. Nasheed, who was ousted from his post in 2012, has been operating out of Colombo in Sri Lanka since then. And Neelam Deo, former Indian ambassador to Denmark and Ivory Coast, and of course director at Gateway House, joins us now. Thank you so much for speaking with us this evening, Ms. Deo. The big question is, should India do anything more than the advisory it has put out right now? So far it has said this is disturbing, they're watching everything very closely, but there is an expectation for them to do more. All right, I don't seem to be having Ms. Deo's audio. We'll try and reconnect that, but here is where the story gets important, is because the former Maldivian president has, sitting in Colombo, of course, he's on self-exile, has asked the Indian government for help. It becomes a tricky situation because how much can the Indian government do at this point? Ms. Deo, can you hear me? I believe we have your audio back on.
I can hear you, yes, thank you.
All right, fabulous.
I can hear you.
So my question to you, and I'll repeat that question, was what should India do at this point?
I think India has to consider all the alternatives. There will always be requests from groups in neighboring countries whenever there is political dissidence of this nature, and different groups will make different requests, while other groups would criticize any actions taken. In 1988, the government of India had actually intervened militarily to quash a coup that was being conducted by some mercenaries from Sri Lanka. The situation has changed greatly since then, when President Gayoom was restored to power with the assistance of Indian troops. Today you have an attempt within Maldives where many institutions of democracy have been set up, a Majlis, a Supreme Court, political parties, etc. It would always take some time for a democratic system to mature. Of course, what is happening here and what is creating a lot of confusion is that the Supreme Court actually countermanded an order that it had itself given more than a year ago, when it had ordered the arrest of many of these people. This latest decision given by the Supreme Court is that that trial was not valid and that a new trial should be held, and that in the meantime all of these political leaders should be released from jail, and people like former President Nasheed, who were in self-exile, be allowed to return and undertake normal political activity. I think India also has to consider that even though the United States, the UK, other members of the Commonwealth, probably also the government of Sri Lanka, would support actions taken by India to try to resolve these political problems. But military action is not the first alternative for anybody, and there is no question that Government of India has been sending messages. It will be conveying its views. We have a fine ambassador in Male, and like other governments, we would have to wait and see how the situation evolves.
You know, Ms. Dev, this is interesting because former President Gayoom has, you know, also asked for help. Now the question is about the increasing Chinese influence in Maldives. In that context, does India now find the need to reassert its sphere of influence on the island nation?
You know, the present government in the Maldives has certainly done some very strange actions. For instance, it pushed through in about an hour's time a free trade agreement with China, while only the members of the Majlis, the members of their parliament, were given only about an hour to even look at a huge document. This is of great concern to India, because with India, countries like Maldives, other of our neighbors like Nepal, Bhutan, we have really open borders. Anything can be traded across these borders. So if Maldives has a free trade agreement with China, that means that goods from China can be moved into India. At the same time, they also amended the constitution in the same way by simply steamrolling members of the Majlis to provide China with some kind of access to one of their uninhabited islands. All these are issues of concern to India. There is a lot of Indian investment in Maldives. Companies like the Tatas have holiday resorts. There are hundreds of Indian origin teachers. There are other professionals who work in the Maldives. All of these are matters of interest. But is there some level of contestation with China? Yes, I think that is happening in our entire neighborhood, where China today has a much higher profile than it had in the 80s and 90s of the last century.
All right, thank you so much, Neelam Deo, for speaking with us this evening on Prime Time. And we'll take a very small break here, but coming up next is Prime Time debate. We're going to be talking about trouble within the NDA. After the Shiv Sena, it's the TDP. Will this impact the BJP's electoral prospects? Does it make any difference to them? We're going to be speaking with Arvind Sawant, the MP of the Shiv Sena, in the Lok Sabha, Aditi Fadnas of Business Standard, and of course BJP spokesperson Shaina NC. That conversation coming up next.